try to correct them. If you can't correct them, you try to get them to change the topic discreetly. Just sometimes you just have to sort of, interrupt. Say, by the way, how's your cousin so-and-so doing? Did they get married already? So, or you ask something else. Someone likes hockey. Especially being a Torontonian, and I'd promised someone not to do that, but I can't help it. There's few more feeble franchises in the world than the Toronto Maple Leafs. So, but you ask somebody, so how are the Leafs doing? And there'll be a long story that will ensue because there's always lots of bad news. So, just ask an open question. But otherwise, you go and do something. You can do something. One of the most useful things to go is go and surf. Grab some water. Usually it's not a bad idea to serve water, or help make the tea, or go talk to the kids, or when all else fails, go to the washroom. One of the most useful places in people's houses is the washroom, because it's a safe space. Like people are having a religious argument, you don't know where to go, just go to the washroom for a little bit. And there's nothing wrong with remaining in the washroom. You can't stay too long, but something that can help formulate a better plan of action. What do I do next? Well, let me retreat to the washroom, figure it out, and then I will re-engage, right? So those are some of the things. But then not all family gatherings are necessarily worth going to. There's certain things that you shouldn't be attending this kind of gathering, right? People are getting together to do something that is not allowed Islamically. Then don't participate. Or show up before what they're doing or after. They're going to go watch something that you shouldn't, but they're going to have dinner before it or after it. So you join them for the dinner or the lunch or whatever, then you give the other thing a miss. Find some legitimate excuse or the other. So those are ways that one can navigate to the extent that one can. But social gatherings are one of the things that most hurt people in their deen. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we referred to that in our lessons, that there's no good in most of their gatherings, right? Unless the gathering is purposeful, it upholds the good, one calls to the good in it. And the trick is, how does one do that without being a religious heavy? One of the ways is, don't talk unnecessarily about the religion, right? Anytime something wrong comes up, keep avidly and carefully changing the topic. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us wisdom and facilitation in that. Okay. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. Alhamdulillah, in our classes on Imam Ghazali's Ihya Ulumuddin, we have reached the end section of the book on commanding the good and forbidding the wrong. Commanding the good and forbidding the wrong is one of the central duties of our religion. And we've highlighted the importance of that in previous lessons. And there's this really powerful statement of Imam al-Ghazali at the beginning of the book, that truly commanding the good and forbidding the wrong is the greatest support of the religion. It is the duty for which Allah Most High sent forth all prophets. If commanding the good ceases or is ignored or not acted upon, then prophetic guidance will become ineffectual. Religiosity will be wiped out. Lack of concern will become widespread. Misguidance will prevail. And ignorance will spread. Right? So, and we looked at the dimensions and importance of this. So today we're looking at one particular component of this, and that is commanding the good with respect to the leaders of society, commanding the good and forbidding the wrong with respect to the leaders of society. Now, this applies most directly to those living in Muslim countries, because the leaders of the Muslims have a duty to safeguard both the worldly interest of the Muslims, but also the religious interest, then the religious and the public religious good. And because the role of government and rulers are that they ensure the preservation of rights, the prevention of wrong and injustice, and to promote the good, right? Both the worldly good through their economic and social and educational policies, but also the religious good, and to prevent harm at each of these levels. So from that is that there not be public harm. But what if the rulers themselves are doing the wrong? Whether at the individual level, the ruler is drinking, the ruler is openly engaged in haram, or their policies are promoting the wrong. So Imam al-Ghazali tells us that we saw earlier in our work that there are three levels of commanding the good and forbidding the wrong. The first way of commanding the good and forbidding the wrong is just making it known in general. Your friend is tired and he's eating a sandwich, and it's a bacon sandwich. And he didn't know what bacon is, because he had bacon back home, and there the bacon was halal turkey bacon. But here by default bacon isn't. So the baseline way of commanding the good is just make someone know that, is to making it known. This is called ta'rif. That, by the way, that is bacon, it's pork, it's not allowed. And sometimes that's sufficient. And this also, of course, quite useful because certain situations we assume too much. Someone is doing something really outrageous and they don't know that it's haram. Someone saw that the guy next to them is having some nice looking drink. It's a sparkling drink. So I'd like some of that too. He said, uncle, by the way, that is champagne. Champagne is a type of alcohol. Oh, astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah. Right, so you're just making it known. So you assume the best. You should start with the simplest thing. That's one level of commanding the good. The second is admonishing. Admonishing. That you make it known, but say, well, but your friend tries to do the right thing, so you admonish them. Then no, like you tell them, have you prayed Asr? They said no. So, well, time's going to go out in 40 minutes. It's okay. But especially when you're hopeful that they'll listen, or that they should listen, you admonish them, you remind them that, delaying Asr till this time, etc. So you admonish them in a good way. And we looked at that. And that's also where, when somebody is likely to listen, you give them admonishment with wisdom, with good words. It's like yesterday we were driving someone home, and it's a lady. She was sitting in the front with my wife. And out of the blue, she said, I need dua for one thing, that Allah inspire me to wear hijab. So that's what I most ask Allah for. So my wife would just just make it, just part of the way you admonish, you just say, do such and such, right? Why don't you? And you admonishment isn't necessarily fire and brimstones. You give a practical encouragement. And one of the ways of admonishing or reminding somebody is to facilitate how they do it. Just to facilitate how they do it, and to make the ultimate purpose and benefit of it tangible before them. The third level is to censure or take matters in your own hands. Now, in our personal relationship, sometimes one could take matters into one's own hand. Let's say you have a good friend. Let's say they had some tough life things happen. So they're drinking something. You say, by the way, that's wine. They look at you. They turn their head in multiple directions. And then they take a sip. Say, that's haram. They didn't listen. So maybe you could take it, just throw it in the bin, because it's gone. And say, and you come with me. Now, sometimes you can take, within family, with a close friend, you could take things into your own hands. Now, doing that in society requires greater caution. Why? Because it can have wider negative consequences. Right? And the believer has to be aware of the consequences of their actions. And this is particularly true when it comes to leaders. Imam al-Ghazali says that of the three ways of commanding the good, which is making the matter known, admonishing or reminding, it's number 2, or number 3, which is rebuking and verbally or taking matters into one's own hands. So typically with rulers, in most cases, one would do only the first 2, which is making it known and admonishing, reminding. The third requires particular caution, which is where you go beyond admonishing to verbally rebuking or taking matters into your own hands. And you have to be careful, because what are the consequences on that for you, but also what are the public consequences? As for if the harm relates to you, you can allow yourself to be harmed. Okay? And if you are harmed in commanding the good and forbidding the wrong, that is a type of martyrdom. And the Prophet ﷺ said that the highest of jihad is a word of truth before an unjust leader. A word of truth before an unjust leader. So if you do that, you are rewarded. But sometimes doing things like this could have negative public consequences. Negative public consequences. So the harm doesn't relate to you, relates to others. So the ruler was at a ceremony for the opening of a big bar. So you decided to go with cricket bats and smash the bar. Now you got thrown in jail, but then they decided to legalize alcohol in the whole country. That's to fight fanaticism, we will legalize drinking. Okay? So your act of bravado led to much greater public harm. That is considered foolish action. So there, in rebuking rulers or compelling them with one's actions, taking things into one's own hands, Imam al-Ghazali said that what's allowed with rulers is making matters known. You have to speak up that this is not allowed. Reminding them, right? Using other means of wise correction, but taking matters into one's own hands or being firm requires deep consideration, lest it result in greater and wider harm. Right? If the harm is related to you, you can take it on yourself, and we'll see some examples of that. Otherwise, it requires critical consideration of consequences, lest the societal harm be greater than any potential good. In this, one should consult. One should consult the learned, the wise, the experienced about consequences. That also relates with things like protests, civil disobedience. The rulers promulgated some unjust laws. How does one now proceed in those? Right? How does one then proceed in those? One has a duty to want the wrong to be lifted and for the wrong to be changed. But how? Yet harm is not lifted by harm. Harm is not lifted by it resulting in even greater harm. Right? So that's what requires wisdom. Sometimes the answer is that change is necessary, but change must be gradual. So, for example, there's a brilliant book by Dr. al-Kaylani called هكذا ظهر جيل صلاح الدين. This is how the generation of Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi emerged. Some people are critical, for example, of Imam al-Ghazali, that there's Muslim lands that are under Crusader rule, including Jerusalem, for example. And there are other Muslim lands overturned. Why didn't he emphasize engaging in jihad then? But a number of the great scholars of Islam realized that the source of our weakness is the weakness of the faith and practice that has spread in the Muslims. So you can't change something immediately. Then what do? You have to say, okay, what do we do to plant the seeds of change? So Imam al-Ghazali put not only his own personal effort in the spreading of knowledge and the preservation and renewal of Islamic scholarship, but he was the catalyst for a whole complex, a whole network of educational seminaries, the Nizamiya seminaries that resulted in generations of scholars, and then through them there's regional and rulers that were affected, and likewise other great scholars, so that the generation before Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, the Sultan was one of the righteous. That was Nur ad-Din az-Zanji, one of the few rulers in later Islamic history who everyone who knew him held him to be of one of the righteous. Because he was. Read his biography. He was not only a brilliant ruler, he was widely acknowledged to be one of the righteous. Very rare in history, because power corrupts. They say the favorite Quranic verse of rulers is Ayatul Kursi, right? Because if you've got the Kursi, you hold on to it. So but then from that emerged the army of Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, right? That was one given divine assistance, but also that was driven by faith and by principle, as we know by how Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi dealt with both the Christian sites, but also by these Christian scholars and priests and leaders and others, and the Christian and citizens of Jerusalem, whoever wanted to leave was given safe passage, and no religious monuments were destroyed, and no one, once the battle was over, no one was killed in retribution, even though before, when the Crusaders took over Jerusalem, one of the great historians of Islam, Ibn al-Athir, wrote about it because he was there. Or I don't know if he was there directly or he was narrating directly that today was one of the most shameful events in human history. He said there was literally blood flowing down the streets from the extent of the massacre. Right? But we are people of principle. So sometimes change takes time. You realize there's a problem, you don't accept it, but the point isn't just to say something or do something. The point is that the means be taken for the change. Right? So this requires careful thought. The early Muslims frequently considered and they took a stance. They took a stance when it affected them alone, right? Because they were not afraid of personal harm, because they consider that a type of shahada, a type of martyrdom. But this is not an obligation, right? If you're weak and you see a ruler doing something wrong, and if you were to do something, you would be imprisoned, you would be hurt, harmed, etc. Do you have to speak out? No. Allah has lifted that burden from you. You can do something wrong yourself, but you hate it in your heart and you're patient. If it affects your own religious practice, then you have the duty to migrate, right? But if the harm is only to yourself, you are rewarded for taking that step. And the Prophet ﷺ said, the best of jihad is a word of truth before an unjust ruler. And Imam al-Ghazali mentions a whole number of examples from the way of the early Muslims. However, this is not if it would cause greater public harm. If it would cause greater public harm. So to use a Canadian example, for a long time, Muslims were engaging in religious adjudication, which is an option that religiously Muslims have a right to do. In the apps, that even if there are Muslim judges, qadis there, two parties could agree to have a third person as an adjudicator, what's called a muhakkim, to judge between them. Not as a judge, it's a voluntary process. So Jack and Jill had a fight. And they're fighting over the hut. Each says it belongs to me. They can't resolve it. So they go to Sheikh Sufyan. He wants to mediate, said, we don't want any settlement. We just want a decision. Whose is it? So he takes due process and he has to judge between them, but it's a voluntary. They just willfully agreed to listen to Sheikh Sufyan. Anything wrong with that? No. Now, morally, if you hold yourself to binding adjudication, you cannot refuse the judgment afterwards. That's something that people do. And this has been practiced by Muslim communities, particularly with respect to marital disputes. A woman wants annulment of her marriage, etc. So this is just adjudication. I don't know if most of you are probably too young, but early 2000s, this whole commotion in Canada about Sharia courts. And some over-enthusiastic Muslims, some of them turned out that they're actually informants for our noble land, right? Like paid informants and instigators, right? Saying that we have a right to Sharia courts. Now, the sure way to get anything banned is to refer to it as Sharia anything, especially courts, right? And also an unwise way of seeking your rights. So what happened? Not only was religious adjudication not allowed for us, but Jewish peoples also lost that. And their religious adjudication was actually recognized in court, and there's case law precedents, etc. But there's no reward for folly, for foolishness. Right? There's no reward for foolishness. So if the public consequences will be harmful, then you don't do it. That's why in correcting, one should consult. A few of the examples that Imam al-Ghazali gives of the early Muslims with regards to this is that one of the great companions, Abu Sa'id al-Khudri radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, with Marwan ibn al-Hakam, one of the rulers. So Marwan ibn al-Hakam gave the khutbah before the prayer. The Friday khutbah before the prayer. Sorry, not the Friday khutbah, astaghfirullah. The Eid khutbah before the prayer. The Eid khutbah we give after the prayer, as you know. So a man said to him that the khutbah is after the prayer, not before it, for the Eid prayer. So Marwan, the Sultan at the time, said, leave that alone, O you. So the companion of the Prophet ﷺ, Sayyidina Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, intervened. He said, as for this man, he has fulfilled his duty, meaning the man who corrected the ruler. Because the Messenger of Allah ﷺ said, whoever of you sees a wrong must change it with their hands. And if you cannot, then with your tongue. And if they cannot, then with their heart, and that's the least of faith. Right? So he spoke up because the ruler wanted to give the khutbah before the prayer. He said, so he supported the man who spoke out. And Marwan was known for being a particularly unjust ruler. Right? And similarly, it happened with the son of Marwan ibn al-Hakam, namely Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. And we are blessed and tested by Allah by having some of the worst rulers of history were the rulers who ruled over the Muslims throughout history. For much of our history. Unjust rule. Right? So, once one of the great early Muslims, Ata ibn Abi Rabah, he entered the majlis of Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. And he was seated on his dais, like his raised platform. And around him were the notables from all across the Muslim lands. And this was in Mecca. During the time of Hajj, when Abdul Malik ibn Marwan was the Khalifa. When Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, the Khalifa, saw Sayyidina Ata, one of the great Imams of the early Muslims, Abdul Malik ibn Marwan stood up and took Ata, this great scholar, and had him sit next to him on the raised dais. So he asked him, Abu Muhammad, meaning Ata, what need do you have? Right? And all the notables are around. So Ata says, in front of everybody, says to the ruler, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, ittaqillah fi hurumillah. Said, O commander of the believers, be fearful of Allah regarding the limits of Allah and regarding the haram of his messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The haram of Allah meaning Mecca, the Kaaba, and the haram of the messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam meaning Medina. Pay attention to them by maintaining their buildings and have taqwa of Allah regarding the children of the Muhajirin and the Ansar, because it is through their efforts that you are sitting where you are sitting, and have taqwa of Allah regarding the people who are defending the boundaries of the Muslims. This is called Ahl al-Thughur, because the boundaries of the Muslim lands would be, in the early days of Islam, would be guarded by volunteers. They would go to the boundaries, and this would be called, they call Ahl al-Thughur, and they would be engaging in ribat. They would set up fortresses to defend the Muslim lands, but they would do it as a voluntary religious act. And it's one of the highest types of jihad. But they would be neglected, right? Because the rulers would be great. You want to go do it? Go. But now you go, if you're not being supported by anyone, you're at the frontier of the land, there's no one feeding you, supporting you, how could you remain there? It says because they are the fortress of the Muslims. And he said, and take good care to preserve the interests of the Muslims, because you alone are the one who's ultimately responsible for their affairs. He says, and have taqwa of Allah regarding those who stand at your door, coming to you with need. Don't forget about their needs and never close their door on them. That's pretty intense things to say when you're sitting next to the ruler. Okay? So, Abdul Malik ibn Marwan said, I accept, I'll do it. So Ata got up and grasped Abdul Malik ibn Marwan's hand and says, "Oh Abu Muhammad," right? We have only asked you for needs for other than ourselves, and you have promised to fulfill them. Right? What is your need? The ruler said. So he said, I have no need for anything from creation. Ata said to the ruler, as for creation, I have no need from creation. And he went away. So the ruler, and he was surrounded by the notables, right? The ashraf, the notables from each part of the Muslim lands. So as Ata walked away, the Khalifa, who'd just been told off pretty intensely, he said, هذا وأبيك شرف. He said, this, by your father, is nobility. Okay. So, similarly, one of the most unjust of rulers in the Muslim era, Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, who killed numerous of the Sahaba and Tabi'een and the early Muslims, and famous for his injustice. Once Al-Hajjaj called for Al-Hasan al-Basri, widely regarded as one of the most righteous of the Tabi'een, the generation after the companions. So he called for him. So Al-Hasan al-Basri went to him. So Al-Hajjaj asked him that, are you the one who says, may Allah ruin them, for they have killed the servants of Allah just for money? Because Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf killed so many innocent souls, both of the Sahaba and the Tabi'een, but also innocent Muslims. So Al-Hasan al-Basri was known to publicly make dua against him, that may Allah ruin them, ruin Al-Hajjaj, for he has killed innocent people just for material gain. So he said, I did make dua against you. So he said, what caused you to do so? He's outraged, right? Because he's probably also afraid. This is Al-Hasan al-Basri. So he said, so Al-Hasan al-Basri said, it is because of the covenant and pledges that Allah Most High has taken from the people of knowledge, that they will make guidance clear to people and they will not hide Allah's guidance. So Al-Hajjaj said to him, O Hassan, hold your tongue and beware of me hearing anything that I dislike from you, because next time I do, I will separate between your head and your body. That was Al-Hajjaj's response to Al-Hasan. But he continued to correct him and to call him out, right? And Al-Hajjaj didn't do anything to Al-Hasan al-Basri. And there's many other examples of the ulama correcting the scholars in things big and small, even in the sunnahs. Even in the sunnahs. It is said, so for example, the great student of Imam Abu Hanifa, Al-Qadi Abu Yusuf. Abu Yusuf was the greatest single student of Abu Hanifa, became the chief justice, the Qadi al-Qudat, the chief justice of the Muslim Khilafah under Harun al-Rashid. And as the Chief Justice, sometimes he would have to eat with the Khalifa. So once they set the table and they brought forth really fancy cutlery, some of it made from ebony and other fine woods, from ebony and ivory and fine things. Abu Yusuf put it aside. He moved it aside and used his hands to eat. So Harun al-Rashid asked him, why are you eating with your hands? He said, "O Amir al-Mu'mineen, do you know that Allah Most High has said in the Quran that truly we have honored the children of Adam? لَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي Adam." He said, yes. He said, one of the meanings of Allah honoring the children of Adam is that He gave them hands to use. Right? And then he explained to him, and this is the sunnah of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? So even in front of the ruler, and this is not from the obligatory commanding the good and forbidding wrong. It's not wrong to eat with knife and fork, but that even though he's engaging with the ruler, he did not leave a sunnah of the sunnahs of habit, of the sunnah of norms of the Prophet ﷺ, just because he is with the ruler, but with wisdom. But with wisdom. And numerous other examples exist of this, of the ulama refusing to back down from the truth. So Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, for example, refused to concur with the position taken by the ruler of his age regarding an issue related to the nature of the Quran. Even though the ruler was promulgating a particular view and forcing the ulama to concur with it. Some of the ulama used tricks to get out of it, because the issue is the Quran created? And the position, the true position is no, the Quran is the uncreated speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And why? Because Allah Most High has the eternal attribute of speech. And this revealed book, that is the Quran, is the speech of Allah, because the meanings indicated by the revealed book are the meanings indicated by the eternal divine attribute of speech. So when you read the Quran, this is the meaning of it, is the divine address to creation. So it is not permissible to say that the Quran is created. Some of the scholars use tricks. Some of them said the Torah and the Injil and the Zabur and the Quran, all of these are created. And what did they mean by created? They intended their fingers. Right? So they used tricks to save their lives. But Imam Ahmad refused to back down from this position, even though it seemed abstract. But the reason it appealed to rulers was, one, to cast their authority over the ulama. But it's not the right of the rulers to tell the community of believers what they should believe. The role of the rulers is to govern. It's the rulers are not the ones who interpret and teach divine guidance. That's not their prerogative. But also, because if you could say that the Quran is created, then you could argue that its meanings are governed by temporal considerations. So you say, no, the Quran is the uncreated speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? It is an eternal, and speech is an eternal attribute. The Quran points to what is pointed to by the divine attribute of speech. It is beyond time. That's why it's not given to abrogation or anything like that. So Ahmad suffered torture and imprisonment to stand up for the truth. So this is one of the important duties. Right? But how do we engage then in promoting the truth? There's a few things. Some of these don't apply to us because we don't hold non-Muslim rulers and systems to the rulings of the Sharia, but a couple of 6 or 7 of the principles that the ulama mention. The first is that in order to engage politically, so you are concerned about the preservation of the public good, the prevention of public harm. You want to call those in power, whether locally or nationally or globally, you want to call them to what is true, just, and good, and tell them to desist from the opposite. The first thing is the first person you will be asked about is yourself, so you need to know your personal obligations and what is the ethical code that governs you as a believer, so that you can conduct yourself as a servant of God and act in accordance with the values that you as a servant of God, because that's who you are, must uphold wherever you may be. Secondly, you do not leave nor risk your personal obligations nor step down from your ethical principles. That you don't compromise on the truth. So people say, well, it's like, the Quraysh tried to negotiate with the Prophet ﷺ. They said, look, we'll worship your Allah for a year if you worship our idols for a year. We won't say anything bad about your religion. Don't say anything about our beliefs. So we don't leave nor risk our personal obligations, nor step down from our ethical principles. What is right is what Allah has deemed to be right. What is wrong is what Allah has deemed to be wrong. And we don't compromise on those eternal truths. Thirdly, we distinguish between being discreet and wise, which is to uphold the truth, but with consideration of circumstances, and between ethical weakness, where we leave what is right just because it's awkward. Just because it's awkward. That you are part of a local government, they're about to promulgate a discriminatory law. That is wrong. It is unjust. Whoever it may be unjust to. But you're like, well, in order for me to get a cabinet position, let me just keep quiet about this. I don't know. The least of it is you hate it in your heart, but you cannot be party to what's wrong. You cannot be party to what's wrong. Right? And there's a difference between discretion and moral weakness, which is to accept a wrong, because the means do not justify the ends. Right? Allah takes us to account both for the means and the ends. Actions are judged by 3 things: intentions, the soundness of intention, soundness of action itself, and the soundness of outcomes that are sought by the action. You're not responsible for the results, but you must consider 3 things: soundness of intention, the action itself must be sound, and what you're seeking through the action must be sound. That's number 3. Number 4 is that political engagement, public engagement entails many difficult choices. Many things where you, particularly if you begin engaging in that sphere, you may not know what are the consequences. So, you must consult the people of knowledge and the people of experience, people of integrity, on how to navigate difficult choices with truth, principle, and integrity. Because if you don't, you will unwittingly fall into harmful short-sighted choices where you compromise what is true, what is just, what is right. Number 5 is turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala before critical choices. Right? And strive to choose on the basis of what choice, all things considered, is objectively most likely to be acceptable or pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Number 6, and related to that is the way to operationalize that is that you should make istikhara related to your public engagement as you should be making istikhara relating to your private critical decisions. And finally, you must cultivate your faith, your knowledge, and your core religious routines and sustain good company, because these are what give you light in your heart, in your consciousness, so you can see with the light of faith the truth as true and have the strength to follow it, and that give you the light of faith and its strength to see what is false as false, so that you can avoid it, as is come in the supplication. Allahumma arina al-haqqa haqqan warzuqna ittiba'ah. O Allah, show us the truth as true and grant us the rizq, the facilitation to follow it. Wa arina al-batila batila, and show us falsehood as false. Warzuqna ijtinaba, and grant us to stay far away from it. So these are 6 things to cultivate if one wants to engage in political or social engagement. And this would apply to Muslim lands as well, but particularly and sometimes it's even more difficult in Muslim lands, but these are 6 of the principles that the ulama mentioned that you have to know. You have to know that above all, you are a servant of God. So you have personal obligations and personal ethics that you do not compromise. Don't leave or risk any of these. Right? Wherever. Because ultimately you stand alone before God in the hereafter. Thirdly, you must distinguish between discretion, tact, wisdom, and weakness. One is to uphold the truth with consideration of circumstance. And the other is weakness. You leave the truth because of circumstances. 4th, consult. 5th, turn to Allah. Make istikhara an active part of your critical choices. And cultivate your faith itself, your knowledge, your core religious routines, the most important of which is your prayer. And sustain good company. Doesn't matter. If all your company is worldlings or political animals, you just become an animal yourself. Right? You're not created to be a mere animal. Right? You're created as a servant of God. And if you don't surround yourself with a core company of those who are faithful servants of God, you're going to slip. You're going to slip. And that's one of the key calls in the Quran. Right? That لا تجالس لا تصاحب إلا مؤمنا. Do not keep the close company of other than a true believer. وَلَا يَأْكُلْ طَعَامَكَ إِلَّا تَقِيٌّ. And let your eating companions be the people of taqwa. That you must have some discretionary company. And who should you choose as your willful companions? Because you don't choose your family, and your family could be pious, they might not be. You don't choose the people that you're working with, but you do choose your friends, your life companions. You should choose life companions who are headed to where you're headed. And if you're not headed towards the hereafter, then things are going to be tough. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to facilitate for us to be of those who command the good and forbid the wrong, not only individually, but at a social and political level, but with wisdom, tact, and discretion. And finally, that brings us to the end of the chapter on commanding the good and forbidding the wrong. Next, we'll be looking at one of the most beautiful of the many beautiful books in the Ihya, which is book 20 of the Ihya, the 10th book of the second quarter, and that's on prophetic character. I got the title wrong there. It's on the prophetic character and the prophetic way of living. And we will be covering this in late August in a day-long seminar with someone that we hold to be a beautiful inheritor of prophetic guidance, a wonderful scholar whose teachings, whose lessons, whose writings you would find great benefit in, and that is Shaykh Faid Muhammad Saeed. The final weekend of August, we're going to have an intensive seminar on book 20 of the Ihya, on the book of prophetic character and the prophetic way of living. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for facilitation and success. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. So this brings our summer session on the Revival Circle to a close till late August. I have some travels coming up too, but we will continue from here, and then from September, there's a number of people who'd requested that it's easier for them to commit to the Revival Circle if we do it as a once a month session. So we'll be doing that. So we'll be taking that advice, inshallah, because in September we're starting with the third quarter of the Ihya. It's a scary part because I'm a softie. I wanted to start with the most inspiring part. So when we started our journey through the Ihya several years ago, we started with the fourth quarter, which is on the salvific virtues. These are the qualities beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But they say you should begin with the end in mind. Those are the qualities that we should have. But to have those qualities, which is the fourth quarter of the Ihya, we need to cultivate our devotion, which is the first quarter of the Ihya, our knowledge, our beliefs, our purification, prayer, the other religious duties, recitation of Quran, remembrance. We saw all those. Then we need to translate our being servants of Allah into our worldly life. So we looked at the social duties in the second quarter. But now the third quarter is a real call to self-reflection. The third quarter is on the destructive vices, those qualities of character, those qualities of our heart that are destructive. And we'll be beginning, inshallah, with book 21, which is on the marvels of the heart. Understand what is the nature, what makes you a human being? What makes you a human being? And then from that, then we look at breaking our sexual desires, then looking at the sins of the heart, the sins of the tongue, particularly that are destructive to our state with Allah and our relating to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's creation. So that's what we were looking at for today. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. And there's a question online. So for those of you who are on the Zoom call, I apologize for the speaker was on mute for a little while. I apologize, Jazakallah khair, for those of you who were patient. Appreciate it. So there's a question. Does this mean that you're essentially saying not to command the good and forbid the wrong with leaders? No. That's the whole point, is that we have a duty to command the good and forbid the wrong. Right? But we do so with consideration. We do so, we must have the concern to do so. The wrong, what is true is in itself true. What is right is in itself right. Right? What is good is in itself good, because it is Allah who's deemed it to be right and good. And that truth and that good is known. So we only accept what is acceptable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we must command the good. But we do not do so in ways that promote harm, that have greater harmful consequence. We can bear harm ourselves And if one is harmed in commanding the good oneself, with consideration, they're not sinful. But when it leads to greater harm, then that is from folly, not from wisdom. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us the facilitation. Any questions before we close? Okay. So there's one. Go ahead. In what sense? No, so how do you know something, the assumption is... Yeah. No. So we both two things, right? We have good opinion of people, but you don't deny what is evident, right? So for example, good opinion, someone just walks out of a bar. They just walked out of a place. That does not mean they were drinking or doing the haram or whatever. That's what good opinion would entail there, is that you don't give it a negative interpretation. But someone goes, like now, sadly, in Canada, we have alcohol in supermarkets, right? So someone went and bought some alcohol. They actually asked for it, and they're walking out with it. And I say, oh, maybe... No, you don't judge their intention. So the good opinion is, maybe they made a mistake, but we correct the action, we don't judge the person. Right? And that's one of the distinctions, that we are correcting the action, we're not judging the person. Right? Maybe they made a mistake. They didn't know that this drink is alcoholic. It's like I have a friend who was used to a non-alcoholic version of a particular drink. He went to actually the Muslim country and didn't realize that they sold alcohol. So he showed up at the masjid punch drunk. So a friend of mine actually missed prayer because he took this guy home because he was obviously drunk. Because he's drinking what he thought was one of these malt drinks, but it was alcohol. It was alcohol. He didn't realize. He just thought it was just a malt drink, but it was alcohol. And he liked the taste, so he's having a lot of it. So, yeah, so we distinguish between the action and the person. That the action is to be corrected, but we don't judge the person. Maybe it was a mistake, right? And also, it shouldn't change our judgment of the person because you only saw one act. You don't know the whole person, right? And who is a righteous believer? A righteous believer is one who's good, prevails over their bad. So we don't know everything about the person, outward and inward, so we don't judge. Yeah, so to what extent do you command the good and forbid the wrong? We covered that earlier, but when you're hopeful that it will be of benefit, right? But the point isn't just the point is not to become a broken record, but to see, okay, how can I be of benefit to the person? Sometimes someone's not ready for it. Right? Like I have a cousin who was not particularly religious for a long time. He's coming around, but one of my teachers says, religious advice follows the laws of supply and demand. The greater the supply of religious advice, the less the demand there would be for it. So for a period of time, he was going through a rough time. He was asking me a religious question. I'd give the bare minimum response. He'd give me a call. And he said, Faraz bhai, tell me more. I said, well, that's enough. He said, Maybe Musalman, who even I know that much. I'm a Muslim too. I know that much. Tell me something that I don't know. But you kind of have to, like you have to play the long, like change takes time. So sometimes you have to have that concern, but see what is someone ready for. So you have to pick the right time and the right way of saying what you have to say. So we'll stop here. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.